Welcome to TimeOut, an exciting new educational video series brought to you by First Case. In this series, we're bringing you easy-to-access education with no fees and no tests. Break free from boring staff meetings and dive into educational content that you can put into practice immediately. So let's get started with today's episode of TimeOut.
Welcome to the show. Today's episode is jam-packed with facts about sterile technique. The principles of sterile technique apply to any area where sterile procedures are performed. The main OR, the cath lab, labor and delivery, and the GI lab, for example. We can also perform sterile procedures at the patient's bedside from time to time, and we still have to observe proper sterile technique no matter where we're located. But in order to keep this from turning into a full-on lecture, I'm just going to give you a broad overview and hit the highlights. You can find more in-depth information in Chapter 15 of Berry & Cohn's Operating Room Technique textbook. You'll find that this book is a valuable resource, overflowing with helpful information that is applicable to everyone working in the operating room. Now, the textbook definition of sterile technique from Berry & Cohn's text is this. Sterile technique is the foundation of modern surgery. The patient is the center of the sterile field, which includes the personnel wearing sterile attire and the areas of the patient, operating bed, and furniture that are covered with sterile drapes. The level of the surgical site is the central focus of the level of the sterile field. Strict adherence to the principles of sterile technique reflects the surgical conscience of the perioperative team and is mandatory for the safety of the patient and the personnel in the environment. Okay, that was a lot. Let's break that down. Everything is patient-centered. The patient is the center of the sterile field. But the sterile field expands to include everyone wearing sterile attire and everything that is covered with sterile drapes. The patient, the bed, and any furniture in the room. Think back tables, Mayo stands, and anything else that might be draped. Strict adherence to the principles of sterile technique is mandatory for the safety of the patient and for the staff in the room. So, what does sterile technique include? Number one, we only use sterile items within our sterile field. If you can't confirm an item's sterility, it doesn't get opened onto the back table and it doesn't get used on your patient. Number two, the only staff with the ability to work within the sterile field are those who are gowned and gloved. They are considered sterile. They can only touch items that are sterile or touch sterile areas. They avoid leaning over an unsterile area. They don't lean on sterile tables or on the draped patient, and they maintain spatial relationships at all times. This means that personnel who are scrubbed in are aware of what is sterile, what is unsterile, what is clean, and what is contaminated, and how close they are to those things and to each other. Number three, tables are only sterile at the level of the table. Only the top of a sterile draped table is considered sterile. This applies to the back table, the OR bed, or anything else that is draped. The edges and sides of the drape extending below the level of the table are considered contaminated, as is anything that falls or extends past the edge of the table or the OR bed, like cords or tubing. Number four, edges of sterilely wrapped items are considered unsterile. That goes for all sterile packages, peel packs, wrapped items, and instrument trays. We don't touch or come in contact with the edges when we're lifting items out of their packaging or container. Always maintain that margin of safety. And finally, number five, we create the sterile field as close as possible to the time of use. That just means that we do our best to open our sterile supplies and instruments and set up our back table as close to the time of surgery as possible. We should all be vigilant while opening sterile items to ensure that no contamination occurs. And once the room is open, someone must stay in the room at all times to monitor the sterile field and protect it from unintended contamination. Technically, an unguarded field should be considered contaminated, so never leave your room empty once the sterile field has been set up. Okay, that's just the highlights, and it's a lot of information to take in. But our vigilance and strict adherence to sterile technique protects our patients. It helps prevent surgical site infections, and it protects all of us as well. And remember, no matter what your particular role, all of us have a responsibility to ensure that sterile technique is followed. If you're scrubbed in, your vigilance is required within the sterile field. And if you're not, you're still responsible for watching for any breaks in sterile technique or possible contamination. We're a team, and together we work to ensure that the principles of sterile technique are always followed. And with that is all the time that we have for today. Check back next time as we learn all about IUSS. I'm your host, Melanie Perry. Thanks for watching.
That's going to do it for this episode of TimeOut. As a reminder, you can help support us with a like, a share, or by subscribing to this channel. You can also subscribe to the First Case podcast on your favorite podcast application. I would appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to this show. On behalf of everyone at First Case, thank you for watching this episode of TimeOut.